I'm Bill Keat.
And I'm Nancy Lasher. Welcome to Profit, Power, and Policy. We do the research and explore how laws, regulations, businesses, and big money in politics have worked to the detriment of consumers and citizens. Today we have a guest who has helped us get our heads around Christian nationalism and the threat it poses to our government, our communities, our families, and the way we do business.
Tim Whitaker is the founder of the New Evangelicals, a progressive Christian nonprofit started in 2020 to challenge Christian nationalism and advocate for a more inclusive, justice-centered faith. You can find Tim at Tim Whitaker Speaks on Substack, YouTube, and other social media, where he unpacks the theology and culture of white evangelicalism to help his audiences understand the Christian supremacy that is animating the MAGA movement. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Bill and Nancy. Great to be here.
I'm going to ask the first question. Tim, can you give us a basic tutorial on Christian Nationalism 101?
Sure, I can give you a very succinct version of it. I do have a longer, expanded episode on my YouTube channel called Christian Nationalism 101, so people can do a deep dive there. Essentially, Christian nationalism is the belief that America is and always has been really a conservative Christian country, and that Christians, mostly white conservative Christians, have an obligation to keep America that way, both in terms of society, in terms of culture, and in politics. That's what Christian nationalism is ultimately.
When did you see the rise of what you just described?
Well, I grew up in it my whole life, right? So I was born in 1988. I was homeschooled in conservative evangelical Christian spaces. I marched for life in the pro-life rallies. I did missions work as a teenager. I was in that world. So I wouldn't say that it was super as blatant as it is now, but the ideology has always been there, right? Christians vote for Republicans. Good Christians vote for people who want to bring back God and fight the godless left. That kind of framework was kind of always in the waters that I swam in. And I got it in two different ways, right? In my churches, it wasn't so blatant unless it was an election cycle, and I can get into that in a minute. But I also grew up on like talk radio, right? So I'm working on job sites as a teenager with my dad, listening to Rush Limbaugh. And then a lot of those ideologies about what America is and what it isn't, and God and country are kind of reinforced in subtle ways in my church life. So that's just kind of how I was introduced to it. As far as the term itself, Christian nationalism, I discovered that term when I saw what happened on January 6th. When I saw a Christian flag inside of the Senate chambers being paraded after a violent mob stormed the Capitol building, I thought to myself, what is going on? Because as a kid, I learned the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag. So it was very jarring seeing this flag that I pledged allegiance to being used in service of this horrific attack, right? And that's when I started kind of doing the deeper work of thinking, what is this? And the main foundational scholars who kind of brought this topic to the forefront is Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead. They wrote a book called The Flag and the Cross, and they kind of gave the term Christian nationalism, the sociological data behind it, and that's how I discovered the term. And then as I discovered more of what that term meant, I looked back at my own upbringing and thought, a lot of those ingredients were there all along, but maybe the cake wasn't fully baked yet, and here we are.
And then you decided to become a critic and start creating content. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, very committed Christian my whole life, still committed Christian. And the weird paradox of growing up inside of, I call it it's the basement of Christianity. I call it fundamentalism. The weird paradox is that on one hand, you're given certain values very young that I think are really positive. I was taught the song, Jesus loves the little children of the world, at a very young age. I believed that. I was taught Jesus loves me. This I know, right? For the Bible tells me so. I believed that. I was taught to follow Jesus no matter the cost, right? No matter if it cost me relationships or fame or fortune. I believed that. So I grew up in this world. And in 2016, this new politician comes on the scene named Donald Trump. And like most people in the primaries, a lot of us didn't like him. I didn't like him. I was Republican for sure, but I didn't like Trump. And more, I saw Christian leaders start advocating for this guy. And then when he got the nomination, I watched a lot of people that I respected start telling me why this guy was the person to vote for. And then the leaked Hollywood Access tapes came out, right? So you have to think about this. This is very important context. When you grow up in this world of Christian thought, you're taught very early that sexual purity is essential for God to use you as a Christian. If you want God to work through you, you have to save yourself for marriage, and you have to fight against your temptations and your struggles, all that as a teenager. So me and my wife, we saved ourselves till marriage. Like, I believed all this stuff. All of a sudden, we have a man who's running for president who's bragging on a hot mic about grabbing women by their genitals. And I'm thinking, oh, this is a slam dunk goodbye, right? There's no way that my tradition would ever tolerate such a thing, because I was taught that even having consensual sex outside of marriage was bad, let alone assaulting women. And then when I heard the rhetoric of, well, we need a commander in chief, not a pastor in chief, and all of his other excuses that still gave the outcome of vote for Trump, I thought something is deeply wrong with my faith tradition. I didn't know what. I was still very ignorant, but that kind of set me on a path. And then between 2016, the rise of Black Lives Matter, and COVID, all those three things really made me go, I think that my tradition's on the wrong side of all these issues. And that led me to what's called deconstruction. It's a term a lot of us use, who grew up in this basement, eventually get above ground and go, oh my gosh, there's a big world up here I never knew about. And so that's what led me to start content in 2020. Was I was curious, was anyone else out there concerned about the direction of my tradition? Turned out there were millions of people having the same conversations. And that's what launched me into this world of really critiquing Christian nationalism, because as a Christian now, I find Christian nationalism incredibly antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. So I'm a Christian, I hate Christian nationalism, and I want to help people understand what's going on, because it threatens the well-being of all of my neighbors.
And I do want to ask you and emphasize something. You were talking about growing up in this Christian tradition, and you talk about doing mission work. And I know part of doing mission work is to make more Christians in your tradition, but I also assume it was to go places and to help people, right?
Yes, yeah, yes, that's right.
And I'm Jewish, and I'm thinking, like, there's something in Judaism, tikkun olam, repair the world.
Mm.
So, right, I'm thinking, oh, you did mission work. That's really nice. And then you're talking about all of this being turned on its head with Christian nationalism. And as you said, you came out of the basement, you came above ground, and you're thinking, this isn't the Christianity that I'm thinking Christianity is.
Correct. Yes. And what's also jarring is you got to think about, I mean, just put yourself in the position of, imagine your whole life. You grew up in a very dark, damp basement, and people are telling you there's nothing above ground. There's nothing. If you go above there, if you leave this room, you're in a desert wasteland, right? Imagine being told that. Then eventually, for whatever reason, you get above ground and you realize you were lied to. The air is fresher, the sun is brighter. You're actually in a huge house of Christian thought that isn't all aligned on everything, and there's other rooms to explore. So it's a very jarring mental experience to be taught your whole life that this is how the world is, this is how God functions, this is the truth of the moral rule book. And you discover, after you watch your tradition betray their own values that they gave you discover that, wait a second, not only are you betraying the values that you gave me, but there's actually so many other ways of being Christian that are much more compelling than what you taught me a Christian is, right? So yeah, it's a very jarring experience. It creates a lot of anxiety. It creates a lot of uncertainty. Again, in my particular tradition, you're taught that if you are not a true believer in Christ, you are going to burn in hell forever. That's not an opinion. That is a fact. It's as strong of a fact as the world is round, the sky is blue, you will burn in hell if you are not a Christian, right? So when you get above ground, you go, wait, there are other ways of thinking about the afterlife, and people aren't nearly so certain. And there are other, not even just Christian ways, but other religious ways of thinking about this stuff. What have I believed my whole life? All those questions come to surface. So yeah, it's a very intense experience, but ultimately it's very liberating.
I know Nancy's got another question coming up, but I'd just like to throw in there that, of course, I'm quite a bit older than you, Tim, and I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I was taught the same thing, at least back then, that if you weren't Catholic, you weren't going to heaven. So
Yes.
yeah, it is something that, especially as a young person, you think about.
I'm going to move us to the Seven Mountains Mandate. And the Seven Mountains Mandate covers virtually every area of society, and we will not be able to cover them all. So I'm going to ask you to describe the changes under Christian nationalism we would experience with regard to three of those areas: family, education, and government.
Mm. Yeah, so just for a quick overview, the Seven Mountain Mandate for your listeners is a theology developed by a man named Lance Wallnau, who comes out of the more charismatic side of all of this. So people who lay hands on people to heal them miraculously. They speak in tongues. If you're listening to this, you've probably seen bits of this throughout even pop culture. It's kind of in the water. So Lance Wallnau says that believers like him have a divine mandate to conquer the seven mountains of influence so they can essentially rule, right? So you asked me, if I heard you right, Nancy, what are the changes or what are the consequences of these people getting power over those three different spheres, right? Or
Yes,
mountains, education, government, and the family, correct?
that's correct.
I'll spend some time on them briefly. So let's go with the family first. Honestly, let's go with government because everything comes from that. If you want to know where the war on queer people comes from, if you want to know why there's all this talk about transgender people and all this talk about the nuclear family, it comes from this ideology. So Christian nationalism relies on a certain set of assumptions about how the world is to function. It's kind of based on a certain hierarchy. Usually men are at the top and they're very nuclear families, the husband, the wife, the two kids. Women are usually underneath of the men, and then kids are underneath of that. Anything that is different than that order is a threat to Christian nationalism. That's why they focus so much on the LGBTQ plus community, because queerness inherently is not heteronormative. It's not a standard way of being compared to how they view it. So the fact that gay people just want the right to live and be able to get married is a bridge too far for these people, because it's not just enough for them to be left alone. The very fact that queer people exist and that they can be married under the state is a threat to the worldview and hierarchy of how Christian nationalism demands a nation must be ordered. Okay. So that's why there's all this talk about this idea of nuclear family. And also, I need to just be very clear, because a lot of Christians will tell you that the biblical view of marriage is one man, one woman for life. That is not a biblical view of marriage at all. Okay. The Bible is full of all kinds of very different marriage arrangements, polygamy, and also, just for your audience, the idea of consenting romantic relationships being in the ancient world is a very uncommon reality of the ancient world. Okay. So this whole narrative of how God designed marriage is really propaganda in service of maintaining a certain hierarchical norm in our society. So the other one of that is education, right? And this is the thing that people don't realize. A lot of folks who maybe are just waking up to this term or realizing that, whoa, these Christians are kind of radical. What they don't realize is that they've been here for decades. They've been working on this stuff behind the scenes, underground for decades. The war on education really, well, at least the modern view of the Christian nationalist position on education really stems from a guy named R.J. Rushdoony. It's a funny name. He's a prolific writer in the 60s and 70s, writing about God's law, and it's called theonomy or dominionism. And he is the one who says essentially that public schools are modern day Marxist indoctrination centers, and that parents should pull their kids out of school and start homeschooling them. Okay. This is where you get the beginning of the big Christian conservative homeschooling boom, which is very ironic because the modern homeschooling movement before that was started by a Marxist who thought that public schools were oppressive to children because they made them sit all day and learn, which is just kind of funny. I kind of agree in a way with that, right? So R.J. Rushdoony and then Jerry Falwell, founder of Liberty University, they really developed this idea that the public school system is going to indoctrinate your kids into evolution, right? Into whatever else is the hot button topic. A few years ago, the big fear was CRT, right? Critical race theory. It's teaching your poor children that white people are oppressors and that they're inherently bad, right? They always create these new talking points to justify the outcomes that they want. And the reality is that dismantling the Department of Education has been a target for a very long time for these people. They do not respect public education. They don't think public education is a net good. And if they do take over that mountain, they want to make it as Christian as possible. One good example of this is Ryan Walters in Oklahoma. Ryan Walters became the Oklahoma School District Superintendent over the whole state. And he right away wanted to make Bible a mandatory class. He wanted the 10 Commandments put in public schools. So that's a great example of what education looks like under Christian nationalism. Many of them do not believe in evolution. They teach a literal six-day creation theory, and they present it as fact, etc. So that's kind of what it looks like, and of course in government, I would just tell your audience, just look around. All of what we're seeing, our neighbors being kidnapped, children being put into concentration camps, the UFC 250 White House, ridiculousness. That's all a product of Christian nationalism. All of it is. The fact that we have people like Russell Vought, who created Project 2025, that they're now instituting in our government, is all a product of Christian nationalism and the Seven Mountain Mandate ultimately.
I just have a quick follow-up comment. It's interesting when you talk about what the Bible conveys in terms of marriages and relationships. And of course, for thousands of years, a marriage had probably more to do with economics and politics than any sort of notion of romanticism. But it also, I think, to your point, which you said so very well, is that we don't seem to want to have a firm grasp of how it was back then. The Catholic Church was in control of Europe for a very long time, would accept slavery, would accept women being bought and sold, etc. I'm not saying that we should want to be like that. I'm saying we should see our own period that's unique in our own time and not to try to justify it by making up the past.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
You mentioned that Christian nationalism has been effective in a number of ways so far, and it's sort of gained some significant traction. They were successful in overturning Roe v. Wade, yet 60% of Americans feel abortion should be legal in most or all cases. Why do you think that those with pro-choice views failed to preserve Roe v. Wade in the face of this effort by Christian nationalists?
Oh, man, this is actually part of a bigger conversation over what has the opposition done to stop Christian nationalism. And I'm going to speak in some generics here. I'm not saying every single Democrat or person who isn't a Christian nationalist is this way. But I do think that Democrats largely really underestimated and kind of tried to downplay Christian fundamentalists as being dumb or stupid or not really worthy of being taken seriously. Those are just a few religious fanatics who do their March for Life every year. Like, it's never going to happen, the Supreme Court. And they kind of slept on it. I don't think a lot of them were really paying attention to what was happening behind the scenes, and the reason why I think that is because it's hard to understand the level of zealotry that these folks have unless you grow up like them, right? Most people don't have these very intense, hardline religious ideals where they really believe that the God of the universe has given them the divine command to take over the country, right? So if you don't think that way, you almost think like these people can't be serious. There's no way you could think like this. But hey, for 50 years, they fought like hell to overturn Roe v. Wade, and they did. They are persistent. They are well-funded. There's a lot of money behind the scenes, funding legal teams, funding these strategies. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that people who are in the political world who didn't grow up like how I did just didn't understand it, and I would argue in many ways still don't understand what they're dealing with. They just don't. They just don't. And I think that's a big reason of kind of how we got here, frankly.
I appreciate you adding the part about still doesn't understand, because I was going to ask, there's still a sense that the opposition, if you want to call it an opposition, is fragmented and clueless as to what they're up against.
My God, to your audience, I'm speaking on behalf of myself here. I don't reflect maybe the views of Nancy and Bill. This is just me. And I will admit, fully jaded because I'm in this world, you know. If I hear one more stinking statement from Chuck Schumer, I'm going to lose my mind. If I hear one more statement from Cory Booker about the threat of MAGA, I'm going to lose my mind. They have been spineless. The modern corporate Democratic Party, first off, has been bought off by corporate interests since the Clinton years, if not even before that, right? So we have a huge money problem already. The fact that Joe Biden really is, because of the overturn window shifting, pretty much a moderate, maybe slightly progressive president, and he's billed as some radical progressive by the right, and people believe that, it just shows how effective the propaganda is, right? I'm sure we all have those friends who are like, look, I don't like Trump, but the Democrats are radical too, both sides. And I'm like, no, it's not that there aren't issues, but it's not even a fair comparison of what we're talking about. I think the big blind spot I've seen working in media from both mainstream, like MSNBC types, and your more independent leftist types, like your Hassan Piker types, is that if you don't understand the theology of MAGA, you're missing like a huge portion of what motivates them, right? There's a whole subculture that I grew up in of pastors and music artists and authors who are really well known, who shape the minds of millions of people every week through their books or through their sermons, that are in complete lockstep with this administration. So if you don't know, for example, if you don't know the name Mark Driscoll or Doug Wilson, you really don't understand what's happening with MAGA today. Those are two very influential pastors. One has over 1 million followers on social media, speaks at Turning Point USA events regularly. The other guy, Doug Wilson, is Pete Hegseth's pastor. Doug Wilson wrote a book in the 90s where he said that slavery was largely, I'm not kidding, a racially harmonious time in our country's history. That's who disciples Pete Hegseth, the man who's in charge of our military. The fact that not one Democrat asked Pete Hegseth about his ties to Doug Wilson during his confirmation hearing made my blood boil, because it shows that they don't understand the religious side of this, right? They're talking about Pete Hegseth's marriage and his abuse. Good, great. But if you don't talk about Doug Wilson, the man who wants to help repeal the 19th Amendment in his lifetime, and who thinks that slavery was largely racially harmonious, and who, by the way, and I have all the footage of this, a week after 9/11, Doug Wilson said while preaching, the greatest tragedy of that event was not the planes hitting the towers. It was the ecumenical worship service that happened in Congress where a lady bishop was featured and a Muslim imam was featured. That was the greatest tragedy, he said, of 9/11. That man disciples Pete Hegseth, and no one's talking about it in the mainstream. So yeah, that's why I get so fired up, because people don't realize what they are dealing with. They are dealing with radical people who are going to turn this country upside down, and the opposition doesn't really exist.
I'm in agreement. I'm really, really disappointed that there's no meaningful, coordinated opposition to this.
Yeah.
Couldn't
Me
agree
too.
with you more.
That's why I keep yapping on a microphone. I got to get it out somewhere, like, is anyone out there seeing this,
We appreciate your efforts.
Yes, yes. Can you describe what might be called the Christian pecking order as perceived by Christian nationalists?
Give me a little more context. What do you mean?
Okay. When we did our part 1 to this, Bill and I talked about Christian nationalists, Christian government, and again, I'm Jewish. I said, well, which Christians? There are so many types of Christianity. I'm clueless. Tell me who's going to be in charge here.
It depends on who gets the power, right? So look, Christian nationalism numerically is not very popular in the U.S. About 3 out of 10. I mean, it's a thing, but it's not the thing, right? It's about the power. So right now in our current state, the people who have the most power, the certain type of flavor of Christian nationalism, is really the charismatics. Okay, these are people who are going to speak in tongues. These are people who believe that God speaks directly to them. These are people who call themselves modern day apostles and prophets. These are the folks who I think right now have the most political power in our government. And the way I prove that is by sharing the name Paula White. Many people know who Paula White is. This is Trump's faith advisor. She runs the White House Faith Council office, whatever it is, Faith Council. And she is a charismatic Pentecostal preacher who comes from like the prosperity-ish gospel world of, name it and claim it, God wants you to be wealthy, etc. And she believes in things like spiritual warfare. She believes in speaking in tongues. She believes that there are, and I want to emphasize to your audience, I'm not exaggerating when I tell people this. And again, you can go to my YouTube channel. I have a video called "They Believe Demons Live in Mountains. Now They're Running Trump's America." You can watch the full deep dive on this. Paula White believes that territorial spirits rule over certain parts of the world, and that people like her have the ability or the divine anointing to essentially rebuke those spirits by praying against them. Okay. And a good example of this is during the 2020 election, when Trump was telling everyone it was stolen and it was rigged. A lot of these prophets in this charismatic world were all online declaring that God wasn't done with Trump. This is a rigged election, stolen election. Now, they weren't getting there because of data, as we all know. They were getting there from this spiritual standpoint. Paula White actually held a church service where she was speaking in tongues, and at one point started declaring that angels from Africa were coming over here right now. This is a couple of days after the election. And people, the clip went viral, and people were like, oh, this lady's out of her mind. And she might be, but she actually believes that there are territorial demons and spirits, and that there are also angels and other powers that be, and that we're in a spiritual war. And she was calling for angels that were overseeing the territories in Africa to come to the White House or to DC to fight against the territorial demons that were helping Joe Biden steal the election from Trump. This is not exaggeration. They really believe this stuff, okay? For her, yes, it's very lucrative, but it's not just a grift. She believes this stuff. So when she's speaking in tongues, when she's declaring, to her, this is all divine anointing calling stuff to be able to do this. So I think those people right now have the most power. That, of course, can change. Doug Wilson, Pete Hegseth's pastor, doesn't believe a lot of this stuff, but theologically, he doesn't speak in tongues, but obviously he aligns politically. So it's just a matter of who's in power when. But right now, it's the charismatics.
Should Christian nationalism continue its march towards increased political power, what should members of Christian faiths like Catholics or non-Christians such as Jews and Muslims expect to happen to their freedoms?
Nothing good. I mean, Stephen Wolfe, the author of the book The Case for Christian Nationalism, says that under his version of Christian nationalism, the atheist is put in jail, and that he believes in blasphemy laws, and that women have no place in society to lead anywhere. That's not that fringe. I mean, look, if we follow this all the way down, if they get everything that they want, gay people are put back in the closet or killed. I mean, R.J. Rushdoony advocated for stoning gay people to death, okay, back in the 60s. Okay, so that's definitely in the mix for some of these people, for sure. I've had people on my channel who I've interviewed tell me that a Christian nation can regulate slavery, but a Christian nation cannot allow gay people to exist. I am not kidding. Okay. So, I mean, just use that and draw your own conclusions. We obviously become a more crueler nation. Minority groups, people who are not like them, get at the bottom of the pecking order unless they assimilate into these Christian nationalist ideals. It's scary stuff.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to this. We have seen publicly some church leaders that are not affiliated with Christian nationalism, that do not agree with Christian nationalism. We have seen them speak out. It's come from some of the black churches. It's come some from the Catholic Church. Are you hopeful that those voices will expand or play a role?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my opinion, the antidote to Christian nationalism is not secularism, not in the political sense. I mean, secularism is essential, but I'm saying it can't answer the theology of Christian nationalism. It's not designed to do that, right? You need better theology. You need better theology. Look, here's the reality. Whether people like it or not, a lot of people in this country, most, are spiritual on some level, right? Maybe they are just seeking, maybe they're open, but a lot of the foundation is Christian in some way, shape, or form. There's some kind of Christian thing that we're kind of all swimming in for one reason or another. So you're not going to get rid of religion. That's such an impossible, ridiculous thing to even try to assume. And as we know, religion can be used for a lot of good. MLK used his theology, his Christianity, to advocate for civil rights, right? I mean, this is a positive thing. So I think you need faith leaders more than ever, especially especially Christian ones, to give a better response, invite people into a better story than the myth that Christian nationalism offers its people. That's what you need. You need people who will say, actually, what if we took the call to love all of our neighbors incredibly seriously? All of them. What if we actually took the words of Jesus when he says to take care of the sick and to take care of the poor and to feed the hungry and welcome the immigrant? What if we took that seriously as a people? What would we be advocating for as a people? What if what unites us is not our shared beliefs? What if it's our shared values? Right? I have friends who are Muslim, who are Jewish, who are atheists. We all get along just great. Why? Because our values are aligned, even though our beliefs are different. So we need to offer people a better path forward than just, well, this is bad, so good luck. You have to invite people into a better way of being, a better meta-narrative, frankly, in my opinion.
The threat to our democracy and personal freedoms seems clear. What do you recommend people do with their time or money to counter the more insidious aspects of Christian nationalism?
I think local is really important, right? Have you talked to your police about what you guys are going to do if ICE shows up? Have you talked to your schools if ICE shows up? Have you petitioned your governor? Are you running for school board? Those are easy things to think about, right? Local is really important. How is your community going to respond when ICE does show up? What are you going to do? That's key. I think also, and look, I know we all live in a dystopian late stage capitalist nightmare right now, just all trying to survive while we have our first trillionaire. What a time to be alive. But if you can donate to organizations that are doing good work that you believe in, that helps, right? Any nonprofit that is helping people, $5 a month helps. As a person who founded a nonprofit, I will tell you, when 1,000 people give $10 a month, it's really helpful. It's really helpful, right? So I think that's also really important. And the last thing I'll say is that you have to get educated. Maybe you have never heard of this stuff before. You're like, whoa, is this for real? Take some time, get an Audible account, whatever. Read a few books. You don't have to read tons. Just read like 2 or 3 to kind of get yourself acclimated to what's actually going on so you can see it when it happens out there in the mainstream.
So we have the time. I'm going to ask a sort of follow-up to that. Have Americans become too self-centered, too individualistic, too comfortable? We are still the wealthiest nation in the world, as far as I know. We may have been slipping from that. We enjoy a lot of comforts, and yet there's this emphasis on individualism. But does that undermine any efforts to counter what is clearly an organized effort to change America?
I think so. One thing that in this context church offers, right, is a sense of belonging, a sense of togetherness, a sense of doing something greater than yourself. What is the alternative to that? Right? In America, like you have this whole church network that is well established. It's its own subculture. And that's just evangelical. There's also Catholic and et cetera, right? If people aren't attached to a community of any kind of sort, especially in this current moment where debt is so high, we're trying to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, right? Et cetera. We're trying to find ways to afford our healthcare. You can see how there's so many things that we have to prioritize before we can even think about, well, can I go somewhere once a week or can I make new friends, right? So I think it's kind of a combination. I think that look, America is a hyper individualist nation. It's hyper individualism. I mean, to a major extreme and to our own detriment in many ways. I also think with where we are, and by the way, I'm not the business guy. I feel like that's both of you to talk about this. But from where I sit, I'll put it that way. I feel like so many of us are just trying to survive right now. Yeah, I have 2 kids who are 4 and 6. I'm thinking about how we're going to pay for their healthcare. My wife, same thing. How we're going to afford, she had to get a root canal. $1,800. Like, great. Great. We got to figure that out now. I'm not really thinking about, oh, I have all this free time. Let me make an intentional effort to go to the local bowling alley. That's not at the forefront of my mind. I'm just trying to survive in this moment, right? And I think the more that the wealth gap gets bigger, the more that like the banking industry and the finance industry gets more and more predatory, the more that the housing market is unaffordable, along with everything else. There's so many other pressures to keep just our head above water that it's hard to even think about new ways of connecting.
I appreciate that. Tim, thank you for being with us today and helping our audience appreciate the threat Christian nationalism poses to our democracy and communities.
We hope our podcast helps you think about these issues. Who has power how they exercise that power, and how it impacts you and your community. When people talk about critical thinking, they mean a healthy skepticism when examining information. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. We welcome your comments, questions, and topic suggestions. Send your comments or questions to our email, asrb1776@gmail.com. That's asrb1776@gmail.com. And check us out on Substack.